Board games, we might be talking about one little card game, but we're not gonna shout. I say the card game is little, but it's not small. I mean, it didn't do small things at all because it's quite big ambitions. It's Richard Garfield, but it's paused for a while. But now it's back. It's real. KeyForge, KeyForge is what we're talking about. KeyForge, and we're not gonna shout. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you are. 10 a.m. is UK time for Busy Beats and Board Game Blether, episode 860. Today we're talking about why is KeyForge brilliant, featuring superfan Stuart Green. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Bez. I appreciate it.
And for those who don't know you, I mean, you are not a public persona, let's say. I mean, you have been willing to help me and be a public be public in so much as at a convention help me demo my stuff to other people. But you and you are a very extroverted person, it seems like. But for those who've never met you, how would you describe yourself and what would you like people to know about you?
Oh, well, thank you for that. I'd like people to think I'm a friendly, as you say, extrovert person. I'd like to try and make people's lives easier and happier wherever I can. And when it comes to gaming, I'm a massive self confessed and quite happy to be so geek. And I love lots of different forms of gaming, but I think my major passion at the moment is KeyForge, which is
Mm-mm.
what we're here to talk about.
And it's been that way for a few years. So you said in your bio that you fell in love with it instantly when you discovered the game, introduced by Nick Smith, one of the owners of the Ludoquist. And since then, you've been playing, competing, and even running tournaments and building a community.
That's right. Yeah. So years ago, when I was at university, I discovered Richard Garfield's Magic the Gathering, and like I do with most things I get into, I fell into it very deeply and really enjoyed it for a long time. But after a while, I found one of the mechanics of the game in terms of the resources frustrated me slightly in what's called mana screw, which is when you don't draw enough resource cards to be able to play your spell cards.
Mm-mm.
And so I just sort of moved away from Magic. And then a few years ago, I discovered a board game group that met at the Ludoquist. And I've always loved board games ever since I was a kid. And I played them at university in a board game group, which is where I also was able to play Magic the Gathering. And I just thought, oh, the idea of sort of being able to meet up with like minded people and play board games sounds great. So I went along and I was there for some time. And then Keyforge came out. And as you mentioned, Nick came over to me and said, there's a new game from Richard Garfield. I suspect it will be the sort of game you'd like to play. How about trying it out? And as you say, I played it and just immediately fell in love with it. And one of the major advantages Keyforge has over Magic the Gathering is unlike in Magic the Gathering, where you build decks and you have to decide how much resource to add to your decks. Keyforge decks come pre-built and you can't change them, and there's no
Mm-mm.
resources in such.
Yes, it's a very interesting system, and we'll get to that in a wee minute. So that was very much the selling point, and I think it was one of only two unique games that have been issued, by which I mean every copy of it is unique. So the other one, oh my, can you help me here? I think it was called Discover Lands Unknown. And
Uh, yeah, that's a new one on me. I mean, I think there's a game Richard Garfield's developing called Soul Forge,
sure,
which
but at the same time, in the same year, there were two games released. The other one was a cooperative game you would play through. The idea being that in your box, you've got a world and then you explore it. I can give you my copy in a wee bit afterwards,
Okay, thank you.
if you're keen to give it a go.
I think
But
I've heard of that. Is that the one where each copy of it's unique?
exactly,
Oh yes, no, I
as I
have heard of
say,
that. Sorry, yes, yeah. I
it's
mean, obviously
the
that's a
other
board
unique
game.
game where, and the whole idea behind that was that they were exploring modern printing, because with modern printing, you can use digital printing to make sure everything's totally different rather than putting it all on a roller. I mean, modern digital printing techniques are just so amazing,
Oh
but
yeah,
you're
that's
now
great.
able to do it at a scale where for KeyForge, sure, the individual cards are pre-designed for the most part, but there's some algorithmic generation, a bit of graphics where there would be a character that would show this is clearly yours with a randomly generated name spanning the entire deck. The back of every card emblazoned with this name to say this is your card, this is your deck. You can never change it. And every time you bought something new, it would be a new world to discover.
Yes.
And quick hello to Yoda. I hope you're generally well this morning.
Hi Yoda.
So let's crack on, as I like to do. And hello, Timmy. It is lovely to see you as well.
Hi Timmy.
So let's talk about recent highlights, living life and seeing the sights, recent highlights, playing games and other delights. Pardon me. I've been not doing much at all. Yesterday during my show, I was actually feeling a bit rubbish and spent pretty much the whole day in bed. I've been playing a lot of Board Game Arena. As I wrote on my thing, I am trying to engage with the outside world, but the number of games I'm playing simultaneously on Board Game Arena is probably inversely proportional to my health and how well I'm doing at that. So I've been playing quite a few things, and have you heard of, or have you played Chakra?
I've not.
So in Chakra, you're gathering little pieces, you put them in one of these bubbles, and then spend your black stones to move things down or up, although moving them down is always more efficient, and trying to get them into the correct colors, if that makes sense. It's like a little logical movement puzzle, and I've this is probably my third game in the past couple of days, and I especially enjoyed this game because at the end we came perfectly equally tied. As a bubble gets filled, you can move your cube, your little gems past it for free, so it feels like there's a bit of an acceleration, and it's a lovely cerebral game to play. What does that sound like your kind of game?
Yes. I mean, I think any game in which both players can win is always a nice thing. Not
Hmm.
everything has to be completely competitive and cutthroat. So, yeah, I'm quite keen on anything that's fairly competitive but fun with a possibility of an equal result.
That's interesting because I mean, obviously, KeyForge being super heavy on the interaction. I, I mean, I've also played Cat Tower, which the more I played it, the more I decided, hey, wait a minute, these area majorities with the little balls of yarn are super important, and so it becomes more and more competitive. And the dice that I'm grabbing to deny them to you becomes super important. This is a game that was licensed by Alley Cat Games, originally published by someone else. You've got six possible fit. You always grab two dice, choose one. The other one's in the middle of the table, unchosen. One of them you decide where use to decide where to place it. As you can see, those hexagons have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And there are 6 different possibilities to place stuff. Number 2 is about dominance over a column. Number 3 is straight up points. Number 4, the bowl. You need to have different things around it. Another one, you need to have place high. Another one, you need to have a lot in a group. And then the number 1 is a big payoff if you've gone hard into one of the other cat toys, as they're called. And so the game ends when one person's filled up 3 columns, which did take me by surprise the first time, because with a game like this, I normally expect to fill up a lot more of the paper than we ended up doing. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I presume your opponent triggered the end of game. By the looks of things.
So yes, my opponent, by having 3 columns completely filled, triggered the end of the game, and that was it. But I did win by a small margin, as you can see.
Yeah.
It's all down to these balls of yarn, where you get 8 points if you're in the majority,
Right.
or 3 points if you've just got 1 but you're not in the majority. And so having just 1 more makes a big difference, because that means that Dave lost 5 points essentially, and yeah, that's a big swing.
Yes, yeah. It looked fun.
Yeah, it's done quite well for them, and so deservedly so. Speaking of other friends of the show, this is by designer Rory Muldoon. If you know Rory, who did Voyages with Matthew Dunstan.
Right.
This one, you're placing cards, and each time you place a card, you're expanding your pier a little bit. I'm not sure why it's called Pier 18, to be honest. I was expecting there to be... Oh, wait. I think it's an 18-card game. Okay, yes, that makes perfect sense. Okay, it's because I didn't have the physical thing in front of me. I probably would have realised that faster. But yes, you build up your pier. You've got your little objective where you get 4 points. If I have 10 or more flower sellers and lovers, I get 4 points. And each of these colours scores in a different way.
Right.
The blue things, the poets, just score half a point each. The brown things score 1 point for each one on the side with the most. So I score 3 points on the bottom and 0 on the top, because it's only one side that scores. The lovers want to be far away, which feels a bit weird to me.
Yes.
I would think that the lovers want to be near other people, but actually they want to be at least 2 spaces away from everyone else, which means that if you want them to score, you'll quite often have to cover something on the other card by placing it, by covering some of the icons, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And finally, the flower sellers, the little gold ones, want to be near other things. And the flower sellers score 1 point for every other thing in the same group. So this one that my mouse is over scores 1 point because there's also a brown thing next to it, if that makes sense.
I mean, maybe the lovers want some privacy, which is why they want to be...
Ah, yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, maybe you want to kiss and you don't want to be too close to anyone else, and so you want... Yeah. Yep, that makes sense. Have you played many 18-card games yourself? What's your favourite?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. I'm not that familiar with them, to be honest.
That's totally fair. I do find that, for sure, one of the lovely things about them is that they do offer you a real experience in a small package. And of course, Board Game Arena allows me to play many games that I would otherwise never get to play, like Hanafuda cards. Are you familiar with these? Like, this is actually how Nintendo started up.
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, so Nintendo, nowadays better known for making video games, started off as a printer, making playing cards. In Japan, Hanafuda is the style of cards that you want, where you've got, I believe, 48 cards. There's 12 seasons. Each season has... So there's kind of 12 suits, and each season will have generally 2 chaff, which don't score anything. Then one animal, maybe, and one banner, and one bright, as they call it.
Right.
And it there's a lot of different games you can play with Hanafuda cards. It's like their version of French suited playing cards, 1 to 13, 13 ranks in 4 different suits.
Right.
And what's worth thinking about here is that it's a fishing game, less known in the English speaking world. Play cards. If it matches something, you pick it up. Now, there is so much randomness in this game. Not only are you putting down stuff and having the luck of the draw, but also after every turn, a random card is flipped over from the deck that you score the points for. So
Okay.
maybe it's a high scoring card that happens to match something on the table, in which hooray, or maybe it's a high scoring card that allows the next player to pick it up
Right.
because there's nothing that's already matches, in which case, well, you've been a little bit unlucky. And it's it feels like it's not making any assumptions. It's not saying, hey, this is a highly strategic game. But at the same time, there are definitely little decisions to go for. You've got to keep a few things in your mind. Think about, oh, maybe I want to go for that banner rather than this banner because you're also getting points for sets. And so, yeah, how much luck do you think has to be in a game? I mean, obviously, talking about KeyForge, there's a lot of luck that goes on in there because, but yeah, I mean, you can have high luck, high strategy, low luck, low strategy. I mean, Garfield himself has been a big proponent of separating the axes. But what's your take on your desire of luck and strategy in a game?
Yeah. I think I tend to lean towards more less luck based games. Um, I mean, I think the ultimate game with no luck really is chess because you
Or
have.
any number of abstract strategy games. I mean,
Oh yeah,
Go,
yeah,
Corridor, Hive, anything with
yeah.
perfect information.
Exactly. There's a lot of games with perfect information. And yeah, you're right. With KeyForge, there's a lot of elements of luck. For example, one thing I always refer to is that there's an element of stone, scissors, paper, where there are certain decks that play better against other certain deck types. So you can have luck before you've even played the game, just because you've brought the right deck to face off against the opponent you're playing, or vice versa. And then again, going back to the Magic the Gathering thing with the resources, with Keyforge, instead of having resources to play cards, you pick a house of the 3 houses you have in your deck, and you have 12 cards of each house. And the bad luck in Keyforge can be if you keep drawing hands, because you draw up to 6, generally speaking. There are modifiers to that, but you draw up to 6. And if you keep drawing a hand that has 2 of each card, so 2 cards from each house,
Mm-mm-mm.
that's generally considered a bad hand. That's a 2-2-2 hand.
Because you
Uh,
want a lot of one thing so that you can say, this is the house I'm going to activate, and I get to use all the cards. Like if you've got 3 of one type, like here, then at least you get to play all 3 of those cards.
yes, yeah. I mean, and there will be some cases where you don't necessarily want to play all the cards because of what they do, but yeah, having a hand with more cards from one house is generally beneficial because you, as you say, you can play out more, and then because you've played more cards, you draw more cards because you always draw up to 6 at the end of turn unless something's modified that. Um, so your deck essentially becomes more efficient as you keep filtering out one house or another.
Mm-mm-mm.
But I mean, there's luck because you can draw exactly the right card you need at exactly the right time and win a game on that, and you can lose a game on the same basis. I mean, I remember a game where essentially I had a card that allowed me to play the top card of my deck regardless what house it was from, and it happened to save me and stop my opponent winning the next turn, and then I won the subsequent turn. And that was just pure luck. I didn't know what card was going to come up when I played that card. And you mentioned Garfield. Richard Garfield has specifically said he wants there to be an element of luck in the game. And you have these cards that do random things that the player has no likely knowledge of what will happen when they play that card
Mm-mm.
to make it more interesting. Because I think if it was
And I
purely
mean, I
strategy,
think that the tastes are Garfield's tastes are kind of shown when you look at King of Tokyo, the number of power up cards there are, the intention being that you're only going to see a few of them in any given game, but there's probably like 10 times more than you'll ever see. And that gives you the question of, oh, what will come up this game? Richard
yes,
Garfield actually sometimes house rules traditional card games in a manner called Garfield's Trash, where there's a bunch of old playing cards decks and then just mixing them together, taking about 50 of them, and then playing with them. So obviously it depends on the game, but the point being that you're playing this game with traditional playing cards, but you're not quite sure what is in the deck.
yes,
So you could have duplicates of one of the suits, or I mean, one particular suit's hand rank, or conversely, you might have a dwarf of one other suit, and having to adapt to that nature. And I think this was. But before we stop recent highlights, is there anything that you want to share about yourself? What have you been up to in the past couple of days?
well, like a lot of people, I'm sure, celebrating Christmas, which has involved going to a lot of pantos, a lot of variations of Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol, and going to the cinema a lot. So just sort of,
Mm-mm.
I take a lot of time off work at Christmas because I really like the Christmas festive period. And this year, I've been very lucky to be able to really maximise that. I got given by a friend of mine a month's pass to my favourite cinema, the Prince Charles Cinema, and I managed to
And
see.
you do love cinema, and
I
I
do.
thought we might talk about a brilliant thing. Brilliant thing. It's a little thing which is brilliant. Why are films and movies such a brilliant thing?
I think it's because they can just transform you. They can take you to unknown worlds and places you've never been. They can show you experiences you'd never have personally. They can teach you about the world and about interactions between people. How people fall in love, how people fall out of love. There's just so much film can do. And I mean, books are fantastic, and I love books. And books and film, I think, complement each other, but they also have different strengths and weaknesses. And I just, I mean, it's very difficult, for example, to have music perfectly match where you are in a book. Whereas in a film, the director can say, right, this is where this tune needs to shift. And that's just one of the things about film I really love is the emotions that can be driven through the soundtrack.
Mm-mm. And the way the colors on the screen, uh, like as you say, the soundtrack or sometimes the absence of music
Yeah.
can provide a really interesting emotional shift.
Yes, and cuts and stuff. You can have. I mean, the thing in a book is often you can have a situation where the author decides not to show you who's talking for a key reason, and films obviously have to deal with that in a different way. But they also have the flip side where they can shift between two different people talking, and you think they're having a conversation together, and then suddenly 5 minutes into that scene, you discover actually they're talking to completely different people, and that's much harder to put in a book because obviously a book needs to flow in a certain way, whereas a film can
Mm-mm-mm.
jump. And again, that's one of the things I love about film is the way it can surprise you.
Yes, there's definitely a strong language to every medium, and I think that games are getting to the point where, thanks to Jeff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev, building blocks of tabletop game design, and other people who really do work to understand the language of games, we are getting there as well with board games. But films are definitely a they've evolved. They're a mature. It's a mature medium, I guess it you can say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you say, other mediums are catching up with it. I mean, certainly computer games have shifted a long way in a very short period from just being the game to the game being part of a bigger story. Things like Telltale games, which sadly no longer exists. I mean, their games, it's more of an interactive movie than a gaming sometimes, the experience, because you're basically making decisions for your characters and then watching how that pans out.
But the interesting thing there, although I want to pause this discussion so we can actually talk about KeyForge, is the real art in a game is the agency. Because whilst there are parts of it, like the visuals in a, well, even in a board game, you've got the illustration, you've got the graphic design, and in a video game, you've got the animation, you've potentially live action and music, but it's the agency that is the unique part of a game that I think once those unique aspects are really celebrated and really understood, that will be when we can say it's a mature medium.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
Um, so as always, I like to remind people to please do comment, ask questions from like follow. Um, and let's crack on and talk about KeyForge. So, um, KeyForge, you started talking about it, but if you go on to Board Game Geek, which is a great repository of information, it came out in 2018 to a good, solid reception. 2019, we saw a couple new decks. 2020, 2021, more things coming. And then there was a brief pause um, where things went slightly wrong. And it's now been Kickstart crowdfunded, I should say. And it's going to hopefully come back in 2023. Now,
Yeah,
you talked a little bit about what it is, but how would you describe KeyForge to those who don't know it?
I think probably the most well-known reference will be Pokemon. I think a lot of people know Pokemon. So KeyForge is like Pokemon. It's a essentially it's referred to as a collectible card game, but it's not really collectible in the traditional sense. I mean, people do collect all the cards that are printed in a set, but you don't buy random boosters and then build a deck from those. What you do is you buy a deck and it comes as is. Now, it's now been taken over by a company called Ghost Galaxy, I think, and they're trying a new approach, which has been received with mixed reception by the community, which is that you're allowed to combine blocks from other decks to build your own deck.
Ooh.
Yes, it's
So,
an
but
interesting.
the whole idea by Richard Garfield was that you might have a deck that you think, I mean, some of the decks will just be worse, but you'll learn to play with it because every deck will have its own strong points and weak points. And as you play the deck more and more, you'll start to discover more of the inherent strategies, not just in the game, but in this particular deck.
Yes, I'd say I'm not overly pleased with this idea because, as you say, to me, Keyforge, the whole point was the deck came as it was, and that was that. But it's just a format, so if people aren't interested in it, they don't have to play it, fortunately, and the original format still exists. So, just to sort of talk about it as it currently is, because what happened was the pandemic unfortunately occurred while Keyforge was still in its infancy, and that obviously had a massive impact on the game. And then Fantasy Flight Games sold Keyforge to Ghost Galaxy, and they're behind this relaunch. So we're
Mm-mm.
kind of in a situation where it's in a bit of a hiatus.
Sure,
That
but yeah, let's talk about it as it was launched. So you've got your deck, you buy your deck, and it'll look something like this,
yes,
where you've got I can't remember, is it 48 cards, something like that?
it's 36 and Durarchon
36.
cards. And when Dark Tidings came out, it was 37 because, sorry, 38 because of the Tide card. So there have
It's a
been,
very small deck, and so you
yes,
could learn all of these cards very quickly.
yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
a lot of these cards are going to be unique in the deck. Some of them will have, I believe, 2 or 3 duplicates, even sometimes.
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, there's an algorithm, and certain cards are restricted by that algorithm, so you only ever get one copy of them, regardless. And other cards you can get multiple copies. In fact, there's a KeyForge player who collects decks with 5 copies of a single card. That's his thing. He likes to collect 5 copy decks. But essentially, the algorithm controls certain cards, so that these cards are usually really powerful, and therefore if you had more than one of them, the deck would be too strong.
And there is other stuff going on in the algorithm. So, for example, if a card says you'll get, and this isn't a real word, but if you get a bonus for every floob in your deck, then you will have at least a certain number of floobs. You won't
Yes,
have like a pointless card like that. It will make sure that every card that is intended to synergize with other things will have those other cards it synergizes with.
that is the idea, but there are anomalies to that. So for example, there's a card called Exterminate, which says for each Mars creature you have in play, and Mars is one of the houses, you must destroy a creature of lower power, a non-Mars creature of lower power. And in KeyForge, generally speaking, you get 12 cards of each house, and you have 3 houses, so 36 cards. But what you can do is get what are called Mavericks, and these are cards that aren't normally in that house that appear in that house in a different house in your deck. So, for example, there's a card called Silvertooth, which is a 2 elf thief creature that is in shadows, but it could appear in, say, Sanctum, which is one of the other houses. And I actually have a deck that has Exterminate, which is this Mars card, but I have it in a deck that has no Mars house in the deck.
Oh, interesting.
So the card is absolutely dead. It does nothing. And normally, cards can have amber pips. So at least a card that might not be much use can give you amber, which is the key thing you're trying to build up to win the game. And so this card, it literally does nothing. It doesn't have an amber pip, and the deck has no Mars in it, so it has no Mars creatures, so it has no effect.
So that's a shortcoming of the algorithm. That is probably something that we can point to and say, yeah, if they'd thought about it a bit more. I mean, obviously, nothing's ever perfect, and there are
No.
so many moving parts in this.
Oh,
But
totally, yeah.
there's at least one deck where you can say, yeah, there's at least one card here where it's a bit unsatisfying.
Yeah, it's a drop in the ocean. I mean, when you consider how many literally millions of decks are out there.
And you've bought, I mean, how into this game are you? Like, how many decks have you bought?
Well, I keep that a secret. So whenever anyone asks me, I always tell them I've brought 2 decks, as in too many decks. Thank you for laughing. I appreciate your generosity. Yeah, but I have brought a ludicrous number of decks. As I said in my bio, when I get into anything, I get into it fully. I'm very much,
Okay.
that light switch thing. It's either I'm fully committed or I'm probably not interested in the slightest. And so, yes, I mean, I've been playing KeyForge going on
Sure.
3 or 4 years, and I've I've spent a little bit of money on it.
Let's
Yes,
talk about these houses. So, like,
right.
is this a big draw to the game for you? So, like, you've got, you mentioned you've got 36 cards, 12 of each of 3 different houses, and the fundamental decision you make on your turn is which of these houses are you going to activate. And you
Yes,
get to play cards from that house, you get to attack with that house, but the other cards of the other houses you don't get to use.
yes. Essentially, I mean, so generally, how it is that you have at the start of your turn, you pick the house that you're playing for that turn, and that allows you to play cards from that house from your hand, or use cards that are on the table, on your side of the table, of that house. There are cards that have the Omi ability, or have an ability that give you the option to use them even if they're not the active house, or not
Oh,
the same as the active
like
house.
every like every kind of, it is kind of collect. Okay, like a lot of like collectible cards games, which this arguably isn't. Um, it there are going to be cards that break every rule you can imagine, and that's in the nature of the game, where
Yes, yeah,
breaking the rules is part of the excitement.
yeah. I
You
mean,
will
I'd
have
say,
you're making creatures that attack a certain way, except when they don't. You
yes,
have things that behave a certain way, except when they don't.
yes,
And that's part of the joy of games like this.
yeah. I mean, essentially, they're more powerful cards, and that they allow you to use them when you couldn't normally do so. So yes, I refer to it more as sort of exceptions to the rules rather than breaking the rule. But yeah,
Mm-mm, mm.
essentially. So in each house, I mean, there are actually a few more houses than are shown in that graphic there. Now they've added a few more houses.
Yeah, these are all the original ones, I
Yes,
believe.
these are the original 7. Um, each house is quite distinct in its style of play and what it does. Brobnar is generally big creatures. Logos is generally about card draw. Shadows is generally about stealing, which is basically taking your opponent's amber and making it yours. Sanctum is about big creatures and doing positive things. Mars is very much, you need a lot of Mars creatures to do a lot of good Mars stuff, which makes Mars sometimes quite tricky. Dis, as its name
About building up that army and then getting that combo almost.
yes, and the problem is a lot of Mars creatures are quite fragile, um, and so keeping them on board is quite difficult sometimes. Dis, as its name might suggest, is about disruption, and is quite. If any house in the game was ever referred to as evil, it would be Dis, because Dis is full of demons and imps and stuff. And then Untamed is kind of a wild creature based house where most of the stuff is centered around big creatures.
And I think that by having um, these strong characters, I mean, sure, they're not individuals, but each house has a character, each house has a style, and that gives people something to latch onto. You do get people who trade for particular decks because when you open it up, you have no idea what's inside.
No,
But you can say, "Oh, I really like this," and shadows. Does is anyone willing to give me a deck with this and shadows in it, for example?
yes, I mean there's a lot of people that trade based on house combinations because they particularly like the style of that house. So I mean it's very similar going back to Magic the Gathering, where Magic the Gathering you had the 5 core colors, and each color did a certain thing and had a very certain
Mm.
style, and complemented the colors next to it and opposed
And
the colors opposite.
in a sense, the color identity for Magic was vital to the functioning of the game, because without that color identity, um, you would be able to do everything. Because parts of the core idea of Magic the Gathering isn't just what the colors can do, but what they can't do, and that's almost a bigger part of the game, because you can't just play a monocolor green deck and expect to be able to counterspell or do lots and lots and lots of small creatures. I mean, these days they've separated white with white is all the small creatures and green's all the big creatures. And by having that identity, it forces you to decide, am I going to have more consistency, having just one color with my mana, with, or am I going to have 3 or maybe even 4 colors and then splashing something which gives having access to more types of effects, but then not necessarily having the best things, the resources available when I need them. And I think that KeyForge doesn't really need that to function because you can't change your deck. So it's not as if the game would break down and lead to people just playing all the best cards, which is part of the joy of this game, where you're forced to have some suboptimal cards in your deck and some showstoppers, and it adds actually a lot more variability into the game, I would say. It actually adds a lot more drama compared to um, something like Duel Masters, which is a bit, yeah, where or World of Warcraft, the trading cards game, the predecessor to Hearthstone, having what made you fall in love with the game originally?
I think, as I said earlier, it was just the sort of simplicity of it. Because one of the problems with Magic, and you've touched on this when you referring to the colours, is that you had to sort of try and work out the optimal amount of resources to add to the deck in order to be able to consistently play. Because the problem is, like you say, if you want to do a 5-color deck, which allows you a lot more options, there's more chance that you won't have the resources you need when you need them. And you can sort of go, oh, would I have won that if I'd have put in one more swamp or taken out one more swamp? Whereas with KeyForge, because it comes pre-built, you don't have that worry. You can't go, would I have won that tournament if I'd have built the deck slightly differently? It's just, I got a bad deck. I didn't, maybe I didn't get as lucky as I hoped. That's why perhaps I didn't do as well. And you can really sort of blame just luck and say, it wasn't really my fault. I mean, obviously, you still have to make decisions, but if you have a terrible deck and your opponent has a brilliant deck, then all the best decisions in the world won't win you the game. And that's what I love about KeyForge, is that it just sort of, it goes, here you go. What do you think of this? Do you like me or don't? If you like me, play with me a lot. If you don't like me, maybe trade me with someone else who will like me. Because not, as we said earlier, not every deck has to be competitive to be fun. Some decks, they might only win 1 in 10 games, but when they win, it's really fun the way they win. And others' decks are more consistent.
And hopefully, even those 9 out of 10 games, the promise of the win or the decisions that you're making, trying to eke out that extra percentage of winning, can still be fun.
Yeah, oh, totally. Yeah, and I think the thing is, you have to go into a game and sort of decide whether you're playing this because winning is what you're all about, or whether you're playing it to have fun, and you play the decks that do that for you. So there's no point playing a deck you don't enjoy that doesn't win, because you're not going to get any fun out of it from either point of view. But if you play a deck that you don't care whether you win or lose, just because it has some fun interactions, then you can still have a great time, even though you might not take that deck to a tournament. Because a lot of us play online on the Crucible Online, which is a fan-created website that allows people to play KeyForge remotely, and was an absolute lifesaver during the pandemic from the point of view of it allowed the game to carry on when we couldn't meet up in real life.
So you talked about it being. I'm sorry, my voice seems to really be going.
No worries.
He talks about it being a relatively new game. It came out in 2018. Yeah, just a year and a half, I guess, before the pandemic started. And organized play is such a big thing for a game like this.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's the thing, because obviously, I keep referring to Magic, but Magic is sort of the granddaddy, as it were, of all card games. Magic has been
1993.
Magic has been established for so long, it could weather these kind of storms. Whereas KeyForge was still establishing itself, was still building its community. I mean, I was very lucky. I went to a couple of countries to play KeyForge tournaments, and I've met some wonderful friends through KeyForge that I'm still in touch with now. But unfortunately, for them, their communities have pretty much died. And we're all hopeful that with the relaunch next year, that will recover. And I'd like to give a shout out, if I may, to D20 in Watford Junction, and specifically, excuse me, sorry, Adam Waldcock, who runs what is pretty much the last bastion of real life KeyForge at his cafe that he works at. And when KeyForge relaunches in the new year, I plan to revive the tournaments that I used to run at the Ludoquist in Croydon. But unfortunately, due to the lack of stock, it's very difficult to keep the game going at the moment, which is why we've kind of taken a hiatus ourselves. But yeah, Adam and the community at D20 have done a wonderful job keeping KeyForge alive. And during the pandemic as well, I used to play in 7 tournaments over 6 nights a week, one of which I ran for the Ludoquist online back when we could still get the KeyForge decks. But unfortunately, with the transition, the stock doesn't exist anymore. So,
and I have to admit, I've not been to D20. I've just shown a map from non-doxing location in Waterloo in the centre of London. So
yeah.
It takes an hour to 16 minutes to get there.
And I've still got to get to Waterloo, and I'm South London, so it's quite a journey for me.
Yeah, and so it's inspired you. I mean, enjoy your drink, Timmy. Enjoy your pop. In even from that first set, Call of the Archons, it's inspired you to set up your own tournament, set up the community to work with Nick, I guess.
Yes.
Tell me about that. Tell me about setting that up.
Well, so what happened was when I first got introduced to KeyForge by Nick, he had a tournament running a few days later, which I played in, and I will freely admit, not really getting the game at the time, having only played literally one game before joining the tournament, I didn't do very well. I'm perfectly fine with that.
Did you win any game?
No, I think
you lost every single game. Congratulations!
Thank you. I think it was a 3-round tournament, and I lost all 3 rounds. And part of the reason
each round was best of 3.
No, KeyForge was best of 1.
Okay.
Yes. And one of the things I didn't realize when I first played was you could discard cards of that house. So I was holding on to cards that I probably should have discarded and things like this. And yeah, I fortunately have learned quite a lot since then. And I'm, without wishing to sound too arrogant, I like to think I'm a good player and I win a lot of tournaments. So I'm quite fortunate that I've come a long way.
At the point where you're, I mean, you've got to either think highly of yourself, or really be open to being trounced to go to a tournament. So at the tournament, people are going to be better than average. And if you do better than average at a tournament, if you're winning more often than you lose, then that means that you're pretty good in my book.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so at D20, I think I had a winning streak of 7, which was
wow.
Yeah, I was quite pleased with that. I think it was definitely 6. I think it was 7 in a row, and there's generally a groan when people have to play me because I think they probably give me far more credit for my skills than I would claim. But again, it's difficult to sort of not sound arrogant, but at the same time,
presumably it's about not only knowing your deck, but knowing what's the possibilities of what might exist in this set. And every so often, I think they were doing it about twice a year. They came up with a set that had hundreds of new cards that you had to discover, and it would take you time to see everything.
Yes.
And so that would keep you busy for quite a while.
Yeah, I think the advantage I have over other players is that I think I have a very good memory, which helps because there's quite a few times I've played someone and they played a card thinking it does something. And because I know the card so well because I play so much, I'm able to point out to them it doesn't actually do what they think it does. And I explain to them what it does do.
I mean, that's never satisfying. I mean, like, if you've got the card in front of you and you read through it, it should do what you think it does, ideally.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else, of sort of sometimes confusing cards or forgetting precisely what the ability is. So I get why other people do it. Because, for example, there are some cards, or there are some situations, rather, where the timing and order in which you do things is absolutely critical. And people forget and they kind of rush and they go, "Oh, I'll do this," and then they realise actually, if they'd have played a different card first, it would have been more optimal.
Mm-mm.
And I think sort of the better players know the cards so well they don't make those mistakes. And
And
that,
what's your general approach on takesy backsies? Like, obviously, it's a different setting if you're teaching someone the game versus, playing me, for example. I mean, I know the game in theory, but I've not played for probably, I've played literally probably like maybe 10 times total
right,
with everything. And versus at a tournament where the expectation is that you know what you're doing. What's
yes.
your approach on takesy backsy if I put down a card and then I put down another? Oh wait, can I do it in the other way?
I'm probably going to come across because so I have a reputation which I'm very pleased of as being one of the nicest players in KeyForge. That's actually a quote from someone else. That's not me bringing myself up. But I also I'd like to think I'm very fair, but I'm also very harsh at the same time. If my opponent's having a bad time, I will sympathise. If they lose a really key card to random discard, I'll offer them my sympathies. But at the same time, if I'm playing in a tournament, I'm very much we're in a tournament situation. We have to be,
Mm-mm.
we have to be hard on each other, and I try to apply that same rule to myself. So
So
I went to
basically, once it's left your hand and it's face up on the table, you've played it.
yeah, pretty much within reason. I mean, for example, people sometimes say they want to play a house, and then they realise they actually want to play a different house, and I'm fine with that kind of change. But if they've
Mm.
played cards from that house, then they're kind of locked in at that point. And I think I have a reputation, I hope, for being fair and not. I never asked for take backs myself. So I played in a tournament in Krakow, and a friend of mine told me a story where his opponent asked him if
Poland.
yes, in Poland, yeah, there was a Vault tour. So KeyForge used to tour, and we had these big meetups where people from all over the world would come together to play.
Okay.
And a friend of mine told me that he was in a game and his opponent asked him if he could take back a mistake, and he let them. And then later on in the game, my friend made a mistake and asked his opponent if he could take it back, and his opponent said no. And to me, I feel that's really unfair. If you're going to ask for take backs, you have to give take backs.
Mm-mm-mm.
And I take the approach where I won't give them, but I won't ask them because I don't want to put someone in an uncomfortable situation. And I think the problem is asking someone to take a move back can make them feel uncomfortable because they feel like a baddie. But if you're in the final game of a tournament and it basically comes down to that turn,
I
you winning
would
or losing,
agree. Like,
yeah.
but do you agree? And how would you operate if you were sitting here, if you were teleported here randomly to the table right now where I am streaming from,
if
and
we're
we were playing a game?
if we're playing a friendly game, you can take back as much as you like. You can almost restart the entire game, as far as I'm concerned. It's only when I'm in a tournament environment I feel I'm playing to a tournament standard. I'm saying,
Mm-mm-mm.
and I've done this. I've lost tournaments because I've made mistakes because I played a card before I should have played another card, or vice versa. And I've just accepted it, and I've gone. You know what? I made a mistake. I lose. That's how it goes. I have to hold myself to the same standard that I hold my opponents to, and I
It is
feel
interesting, and for sure, digital things like Board Game Arena kind of give an idea of the sort of culture to expect. I find it really interesting. Are you familiar with Root?
I have played Root. Yes, only against AI. I've not played it in real life.
Okay, fascinating. I mean, I love it in real life. If there's opportunity, I would love to teach it to you. Although, if you played the digital adaptations, then you probably know it.
Well,
Anyway,
you,
the
you
points
could
I
probably
was
teach me quite a lot because I've only sort of gone through. Is it clans? Are they clans or the different?
factions, I think.
Yeah,
But
whatever.
yeah, you probably the Marquis, the Cats, and the Irie, you know. But anyway, the thing I was going to say was that in that game, in the digital adaptation, you're allowed to take back anything you want, Like you could go through your entire turn and then say, "Oh wait, no, I'm going to take everything back,"
Right.
as long as you don't roll any dice.
Right.
So the moment you roll a die, well, you're locked in. You can't do that. But
Yes.
because the game does have a lot of complexity, it does have a lot of moving parts. And so I think that's almost a statement from the publisher to say, hey, this is how we expect a game to typically be played. And if it's not a statement with forethought behind it, it comes across that way. Conversely, talking about Chakra, which I played, I had another game of it where I wanted to move three things down one step. And I confused the symbols and I placed on the move one thing down three steps. And that was much worse for me. It actually meant that, firstly, I couldn't move the other two things I really wanted to, but also the one thing I moved, it's actually moved too far. So then I
Right.
had to spend other actions in my subsequent turns moving it back. And that was really annoying. And I'm not, obviously you can't even take that back in the digital adaptation. Although I kind of wish the opponent said, "Yeah, that's a bit harsh," because I just said, "Oh, that I meant to do the three things one space," and it was fairly obvious. And that kind of thing just wouldn't happen in real life
No. Uh,
because yeah, I'd be placing and oh wait a minute, you've done on the wrong step. Oh yeah, sorry, thank you.
yeah, I mean, you have a similar thing in KeyForge. So the online version, obviously the cards aren't as clear as they would be if they were holding them in your hand, and
Mm-mm.
also people can accidentally misclick their mouse,
Yes.
um, and so you know sometimes you have to go, all right, I'm going to apply my best judgment here and say there's no logical reason you would have played that card. I will accept you saying you've misclicked, and I'll let you take that back. And sometimes it's like, no, you probably forgot what would happen when you played that card. So you have to sort of make your best judgment. And obviously, people don't misclick in real life, so you don't have that
Mm-mm.
problem. But people, I was in Madrid and playing with a friend of mine, and they kept saying, "I'm going to play Mars," and I kept having to point out to them their deck didn't even contain Mars and letting them change house. I mean, obviously, in that case, they couldn't have actually picked Mars anyway, so it was never a legal option. Whereas, say, looking at your hand here, where you've got Dis, Mars, and Brobnar, if they said Brobnar and then went, oh, actually, I mean Mars, in a tournament environment, you could, I think, legitimately say, no, sorry, you said Brobnar, it's tough luck. But I would say, no, that's fine. If you meant Mars, fine, I understand. So I'd say I'd like to think
I
I'm a
mean, one
tough player.
interesting thing to note is like I am fully on board with that. Just to say where I personally stand, I am fully on board with once you've said this is a tournament, we are going to play at a different rules enforcement
Yeah,
level. That's what it's called. Like how strictly are you going to apply the rules? Are you going to say that you are allowed to um, I mean, at one extreme level, you might say, oh, this card doesn't quite do what I thought it did. Okay, can I take back basically the entire turn? And in a friendly match around a kitchen table, I think that might be totally fine. But I would say that, yeah, you know what? If I say, okay, I'm going to pick this Brobnar, then once I've said it, I'm okay with being beholden to it in a tournament setting if I've signed up on a form or I paid some money to be there and I'm aware that we are playing to a higher standard.
yeah. I mean, I think as much as I would probably feel justified being able to do that, I think that would be, I'd feel a bit bad about doing that. I think, people do say the wrong name and that's fine. But I think if someone plays a card and they realize they could have played a better card first, I'm very much like, sorry, that's no one forced you, no one pressurized you, you've made a
Mm-mm.
mistake, you've not played optimally, that happens. I do it, other people do it,
Mm-mm.
and because we're playing in a tournament and it matters who wins, um I'm going to say, sorry, that's tough luck. Whereas, as I say, if we were playing in a pub or at your kitchen table or whatever, and it was just a friendly game, didn't mean anything, you could literally take back anything you wanted to, and I wouldn't have a problem with that because it's just a bit of fun. It's just casual. Whereas for me, when I go into a tournament, I'm very focused. I mean, especially sort of going back to that map thing. When I travel to Watford, I'm going a long way. I'm putting a lot of effort into going there. I'm not going there to muck about. I'm going there because I'm competitive. I want to test my skills. And as I say, I will perfectly happily accept when I make a mistake, and I would just go, "I've made a mistake. I'm not going to ask
Mhm.
you because that would be putting you in an unfair position. I
Now,
would just
we've
accept it.
talked a lot about the tournament scene, and I'm aware that we've actually been chatting for basically an hour, but I would like to, if you've got a wee bit more time, to chat a little bit about the casual scene. And as someone who's keen to curate the organized play scene, how do you encourage newcomers to join? How
I've
do
I've
you make it a friendly environment?
I've got
Not
all I've got all the time in the world for you, Bez. Yeah, I think the key thing is to try and encourage people, show them more optimal plays. So sort of say to them, look, you know, I don't want to coach you. I don't want to tell you how to play your cards, but would you like some feedback? Would you like me to show you how I would have played that turn, how I would have done that? So when we were playing online, we used to play D20. Used to play on a Wednesday night, and there's a family of players in D20. Literally, a father and his three sons, and they would. One of them was very young and was getting quite frustrated that every time they played, they went 0-4. So basically, they lost all four matches, and I offered to coach them. So we set aside a Sunday afternoon, and the dad and the son and a few others all sort of joined in. And when you play on 2CO, which is the abbreviation for the Crucible Online, you can have spectators. And so what we would do is we would play with open hands, which means spectators can see the cards in each player's hands, but obviously the players can't.
okay.
And I would sort of, when my opponent played cards, I would say, look, in fact, what I could do is I could log in a different account and watch the game, so I could see his hand as well as mine. And I would say, look, you've got these cards in your hand. Perhaps if you take this turn and play these cards, that would be more optimal than playing these other cards. And that player has actually, and I'm not saying this is because of me, but I think that encouragement helped. This player has gone on to become one of the better players in our community. And I think it's just that sort of encouragement and taking time and sort of removing the pressure of a tournament setting and just saying, look, let's play open handed. Let's see what we've got. I'll show you why I'm playing my cards and what my thoughts are and what my strategies are. And I'll tell you how I feel you could play your cards and how best to maximize those strategies and why I feel they would work best. And sort of just go from there. And I think the other thing is to sort of to make sure people don't feel disencouraged. Because the one thing with KeyForge, like any game of luck, is it can be frustrating. You
Mm-mm-mm.
can feel like the luck has just gone against you, and that you made the right decisions, but every time your opponent just happened to get that key card that got them out of the situation or allowed them to pull off a really brilliant turn. And you just sort of have to remember. Again, there's another father son that play at D20, and the son can get frustrated occasionally. I just sort of try and take him aside and say, look, it's a game of luck. Sometimes it won't go your way, but as long as you're having fun, that's the important thing. And are you having fun? And he's like, yes, I am. So I'm like, well, great. You just got to keep remembering that and just thinking, next turn or next time might be your time. And funny enough, he won the tournament just before Christmas. And earlier in the day, he thought, I say early in the day, early in the evening, he thought, it was all going horribly wrong and he was going to lose and all the rest of it. And he managed to pull a win out of a very difficult situation and then went on to win the tournament. So, I feel like it's just about encouraging people, making sure that they're having fun even when they're losing.
That's a lovely way to put it. I mean, talking about obviously some people are coming saying, okay, I want to work out how good I am. I want to be the best person, the best player I can be. I want to play this game and just be mentally challenged. That's why I'm playing games.
Yeah,
Some other people are going to come to it and say, you know what, I just want to explore this, to see a bunch of stuff. And maybe the tournament setting still works for them as long as they're happy to be aware that they have to think about things a little bit more. Because honestly, at a living room table, if you allow takesy backsies, what that does is it can speed up the game, in my experience, because it means that I'm going to just make a move. And I mean, not that I will ask for takesy backsies that often, but there's a feeling that A, it doesn't really matter, but if I do something that's, oh my gosh, that's so terrible, um, then we can undo that if we need to. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, totally. I mean, the thing that I think it's a very different thing. I guess the best
And
example.
sorry, I don't mean to fixate on the notion of takesy backsies.
No, not
That's
at all.
maybe
It's
a
fine.
distraction from the point. But what I'm trying to get at is the nature of a tournament. The tournament itself has different priorities, and organized play has different priorities. It's, are you trying to make it fun to play in? Are you trying to make it interesting to watch? Are you trying to um, make it make the best player necessarily win? Because all of these are different objectives for a tournament.
Yes, definitely.
And I run a lot of tournaments. I mean, with my own games. I started up the 2 p.m. events quite a while back, and now I think for the past few years, although sure, 2020 there weren't any. Well, I went to 3 conventions in 2020 because that's how many I get to before. Actually, it might have been more. Anyway, that's not the point. Um, but yeah, when I run a tournament, when I run a 2 p.m. event, it doesn't matter so much to me whether the best player wins. I would like a better player to win, but I'm going to prioritize drama. I'm going to prioritize how it looks and how it feels to play rather than making sure that the same player who wins on this day is going to be the same player who wins on the other day. And in the original version, the Call of the Archons, I believe Garfield said, hey, here's an idea for a tournament. Play best of three. Bring your decks to the table and then play with your own decks. Swap your decks. Play with each other's decks. If one player's won twice, they are the winner. Otherwise, now you start auctioning off the chains to decide who starts with which deck, and then go. And that feels like a far more skill-intensive way to do it. But you've chosen to do best of one because you want to make it faster. You want to make it more exciting, I guess. You want to keep it going. You want to prioritize playing against more different people rather than the same people.
Yeah, I mean, the format you just described is known as adaptive, and it's generally considered by most players to be the most fairest way of playing because, as you say, you both play with each deck. So if one deck is far superior to the other, then that should be balanced out by the fact that you both get to play with that deck, and you'll presumably both win with that deck. And then you get the more involved auction element where chains are involved, and chains are basically a way of reducing how many cards you draw initially. So yeah, adaptive is great, but the problem with adaptive is it takes a lot longer. And for example, where I play a D20 or the Ludoquist, we're playing in the evening, and we've probably got maybe 4 hours, maybe three. So we
I mean,
haven't really got time to play.
how long do you need to schedule in a tournament for one game?
So a game in Archon, which is when you know the deck you're bringing to the tournament, is 35 minutes plus 2 minutes of reading your opponent's deck list. And then sealed, which is when you get a deck on the day, is 45 minutes. And games can quite often go to those full time limits. So a game I had to step in last tournament at D20 because Adam was unfortunately unavailable. And I luckily managed to get the tournament to finish in time for us to leave before the cafe closed. And it's a real, there were a few games that went to tiebreakers, so it can be quite difficult. As I say, I think with adaptive, you get 90 minutes for a round, so it's not a full, it's not a full 35 times 3, because of course you've got the bidding of chains and stuff, which takes a while. So yeah, I mean, ultimately with KeyForge, certainly with a tournament that's run in an evening, speed is of the essence, and that's why it's best of one, because as I say, that can take 35 minutes on its own. So you best of 3 would just, obviously take pretty much 3 times as long.
Now, if there were never any more decks released, let's say they released this new deck, sorry, I can't remember what's it, Winds of Exchange.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Let's say they release that, and then they decide, you know what, it's just not worth it. That's all we can release. And do you think that the game would continue to have a life in the same way that Vampire the Eternal Struggle and Netrunner have continued to have a life beyond the point where the publisher was supporting them?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that, I certainly mentioned Netrunner. That has been raised before. The problem is, because obviously during the pandemic, us KeyForge players did wonder if the game was going to die. The problem we have is, unlike Netrunner and Magic the Gathering and Pokemon and things like that, where you build a pool of cards and then people build decks themselves from those cards, KeyForge relies on the algorithm to build the decks for the players. So the problem we would have is we could generate our own cards. We could, form a community to create our own cards. But who would generate the decks and control who has what deck? So KeyForge is very much reliant, unfortunately, on a publisher providing decks from that point of view to keep it
And
fresh.
how important is it that new decks are made? Because there's already, I don't know the numbers, but it's probably like hundreds of thousands of decks that are available.
Well, I can tell you the numbers, because if I go onto the KeyForge website, there have been 2,884,422 decks that have been registered. Not all of them are mine.
So those ones are, so there's way more that have been printed and bought, but these are the ones where people have taken those decks and registered them online.
Yes. So essentially, when I was I was in the Netherlands, they were giving out KeyForge decks almost like leaflets, and people were throwing them in the bin as they left the convention. So I was at a big gaming convention. I can't remember what it was called, but they were giving out decks. Pretty much, here, have a deck. And to some people look at it. I mean, in fact, me and a friend were playing just casually in the arena.
So did you end up scooping a whole bunch of them out of the bin?
No, I didn't. I didn't go that far, but
I mean, that feels incredibly wasteful and sad.
Yes, and the tragedy is, some of those decks could have been incredibly competitive decks, because that's the nature of it, where it's so random you don't know. But me and a friend were playing in the arena, and 2 people just came over and said, "Oh, do you guys play KeyForge?" And we were like, "Yeah." And they went, "Here, have these decks." And one of them, my mate got, was actually a really good deck, and it's just so. The number of decks actually in the world is probably far greater than the number registered, because there will be people that just play the game, like you were saying earlier, on their kitchen table, and they've never imported it into the Master Vault, which is the website that stores all the decks that have been what they refer to as discovered.
Yeah, it's almost certainly tens of millions in that case.
Yes, yeah. So, as I say, there's nearly 3 million decks that are actively in use. People have imported them into the system. So yeah, we've got plenty of decks to play with,
and
but I think people
there
get bored.
Have been for a few years. I mean, we talk about the game being gone, but there's already been like 6, however many expansions. So
yeah, there's been
do you
5.
need these
5
new decks?
There's been 5 release sets Windsor Exchange will be the 6th set to come out when it comes out next year. So yeah, you don't. I mean, you don't need them. And the thing is, there are so many variations, and they're so every deck is unique. So the combinations of cards that make up a deck are so varied that I think you could cope for a very long time without getting bored. But I also think, if you want new players to come into the game and they're going to discover their own decks rather than buying second-hand decks, which would generally be decks that either people don't feel fit their style or don't feel are good enough or just, excuse me, don't interest them. You're going to lose part of the magic, excuse the pun, part of the magic of KeyForge.
Of opening this up and realizing that you are the only person to ever play with this combination of things.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the thing. When you import them into the Master Vault, it says you've discovered this deck. And that is literally what's happened, is that deck has come off the printing press, got into a box, not been seen by anyone until you open it. So you have really discovered it. And you've rescued it from the trash if you're, this convention in the Netherlands where people are throwing them away. So, yeah, I think it needs that element. I think, like anything, it needs a fresh influx of new designs and ideas and cards to keep it interesting. Because people will eventually get bored of playing the same decks and seeing the same cards, albeit in different combinations.
It's been an amazing chat, and thank you so much for it. Is there anything else that you'd like to say at this point as we wrap up about KeyForge?
I think it's very kind of you to say, and I agree. It's been wonderful chatting with you and catching up. It's been far too long since I last saw you. One question I'd like to pose to you. You mentioned that you've played KeyForge in the past. Do you think, with the relaunch, that you might re-embrace it? I mean, I guess it's probably a very casual game for you, but do you think you might be interested in seeing what new mechanics?
I'm surprised you call it a casual game for me.
Well, I mean, you said you only played 10 games of it.
So I approach it in a casual way.
Yeah, what I mean is you haven't got into it in the way I have, so I wouldn't expect you to get back into it in the way that other people that used to play it a lot hopefully will do when the game relaunches. But I just wondered, would you try out the new decks and see what they come with?
Well, this could be the question of the day. And so I'll put a pin in it. And is there anything else that you'd like to say in terms of stories or anything? If not, I will move forwards.
Well, the one thing I would like just to come back to is, yes, having sort of thought about it more, I do remember discovering the thing that confused me when we were talking about it was because I thought you meant there was another unique card game. And as far as I'm aware, thank you very much, Panic Games.
Hello, Panic.
As far as I'm aware, KeyForge is the only unique card game. But yes, Discovery, as you say, is in this sort of
other unique game.
Yes, and as you say, it's because the developing printing techniques that have allowed these wonderful creations. And also on that subject, I'd just like to clarify, when I mentioned about the algorithm in that card, I do accept that nothing's perfect. Mistakes do come through. And the algorithm is generally
improving these things.
Yes, and the algorithm is generally good because there aren't that many decks in that situation. But it's
my understanding is that part of the reason that it stopped wasn't just because of the pandemic, but also because for whatever reason, the algorithm that was no longer available. I'm not quite sure what happened, but the stories were that it had been somehow lost.
Yes. I mean, I don't know either. The rumor I heard allegedly was it was subject to ransomware, but I don't know how true that is. But yeah, no, I mean, the algorithm is fantastic it generally gets things right.
But they will have had to make a whole new algorithm for this new set, is what I'm saying.
Yes, that's what I believe has been the case, yes. And also, just going back to that deck, I mean, as much as that card is completely useless, I love the fact that I have that deck because it feels special in a sea of uniqueness. It's even, you can't have gradations of uniqueness, but it feels more unique if that was actually possible. So I
Yes.
with people in Keyforge, as in sure other collectible games, like misprints and anomalies like this. So I'm kind of proud that I have this completely useless card in this deck. So it's not all bad.
Okay, so let's move on to the question of the day. Question of the day. It's a little question before we go on our way. So if you could repeat your question for everyone out. Actually, I'll rephrase it if that's okay for
Yes, of
everyone out
course.
there. The
Yeah.
question is basically with the relaunch of KeyForge, the launch of Winds of Exchange, the upcoming set, will you feel inspired to delve into KeyForge? Alternatively, if you've already played KeyForge, will you feel inspired to dive back in? Will you actually feel inspired to buy anything from Winds of Exchange? Or me, um, if someone were to have a couple of decks and say, "Hey, Bez, let's play," and bring them over, I'd happily play them. I'd be very curious to play, and I'd be quite excited to play a few games over an evening. But I honestly don't think I will. Yeah, I'm 100% certain that I'm not going to buy any Keyforge. Well, 100%. Okay, I'm as certain as I can be that I'm not going to buy any Keyforge next year, but that's partially due to my lifestyle. I mean, I'm
Yes.
about to move. I'm I need to get rid of a few hundred games to be able to move. I need to get rid of a lot of possessions. I need to set up some systems in place with maybe a distributor and get my own games, by which I mean stuff that I printed in order to sell. I need to get them over to someone else. I've got like maybe a pallet at someone else's space, but I can't just put my own personal stuff there. It's got to be all the business stuff that they are then selling and posting on my behalf, if you know what I mean.
Yes, of course.
But Panic says, I've been curious about KeyForge. I would check it out if offered. And I think this is a recurring thing that for to say to someone, yeah, just buy this deck, it's like that's I think why giving away stuff does work really well. And I'm not saying Stuart, you should be giving away stuff, but if you wanted to do some community building, I think that having hey come into the Ludoquist on this particular day, and it's not a tournament, it's a learn how to play event
Yes.
where people who've maybe never played before, you teach them, like people are playing side by side, and you watch over and uh, like people can maybe experienced players are come along to help the newbies, and maybe when newbies are playing with each other, you might pop in, be ready to answer questions, things like that. I think that's a really nice way to learn because I
Yes.
myself, I think that I learned in a, I'm going to call it a tournament, but it was more of a casual learn the game and we're going, yeah, we played, I think, 4 rounds and it was everyone gets a deck. Someone who had bought an entire booster box and sold them at basically the cost that they cost, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it was good fun. I spent like a whole afternoon doing that in Bastion in Wales with a bunch of other people that I got to know over the weekend. But I never got to play with those decks for quite a while longer because anything where you're saying, I'm going to play this and I'm going to not only play this but join tournaments, that kind of lifestyle choice is a big ask.
Yes. Well, I mean, sort of going back to what you said there about teaching people, when Keyforge relaunches properly, I plan to set up opportunities to sort of teach people how to play Keyforge. I don't know whether there'll be some kind of starter kits that we can sort of set up, and maybe the Keyforge might relaunch with 3 decks, which would be great to sort of get other people into the game. People are more than welcome to find me on Facebook. probably the best way would be through the Ludoquist KeyForge group I set up. So when we were playing the
Are you
tournaments,
comfortable for me to link to your personal Facebook page?
I'd rather we just do sort of the more generic one, and then perhaps if I
Okay,
become
because you
friends with people,
mentioned people can find you on Facebook, so how would they
yes.
find you?
Well, as I say, I have. We've got a KeyForge in Croydon at the Ludoquist group on Facebook. And yeah, I mean, you can link my Facebook page. They're more than welcome to message me on Facebook, and we can go from there. But yeah, so when the game relaunches next year, I hope to start running tournaments again at the Ludoquist. Not sure what night. We used to do it on Tuesdays, but obviously we'll have to sort of evaluate what else is going on at Ludoquist at the time. And maybe do a weekend training session if people are interested. Yeah, so just generally get in touch with me either through Facebook Messenger or through the KeyForge and Croydon at Ludoquist Facebook group. So when we were doing the tournaments online during the pandemic every Tuesday, what I would do was create an event in that group and then post it to the UK KeyForge group and also the London KeyForge group. And that was how I was keeping in touch with people. And people that used to play regularly, I'd message and say, "Hey, are you coming along tonight? It'd be great to see you." So that's sort of how we kept the community going during the pandemic. Because what the Ludoquist would do when they had stock was they would send people their QR code of their deck, and we would play online. And that was a great thing. So we were basically doing a sealed tournament every Tuesday night during the lockdown.
Mm-mm. So
Um,
I've managed to find it, and it does seem like it's gone a bit quiet, but it sounds like you are planning to revitalize it
yes,
after the event.
it's basically on pause just because at the moment we don't have the stock, and
And
we
there's
were
so
doing
much going on in life, you can't be doing everything all the time.
yes, yeah. I say it just we decided pretty much numbers started to dwindle a bit towards the end, and we just decided that with the lack of stock and the lack of numbers, we'd take a break and come back to it when the game relaunched. So I'm
Mm-mm.
hopeful that we'll rebuild the community because I think there's a lot of sleeper players out there that are just waiting for the game to come back before they'll get back into it.
And I think this is a lovely thing because, sure, there is something unique about KeyForge. I mean, being unique, the one unique deck game where there's a reason where different decks are merging. I mean, with Discover, I think Lands Unknown, it did feel like, okay, I play through this with my friends or maybe on my own because it's a one player game, and then I'm meant to swap boxes with other people. That feels a bit weird. Whereas if you are sitting down to a game of KeyForge, you can straight away see the difference because there's not just one, but there's always two things that you're opening, two decks on the table. You can see the difference, and
Yeah,
then your mind starts to wonder about the possibilities. And there are a lot more meaningful differences, I think, in KeyForge than there ever were with Discover.
yeah,
And but I think that the fact that two decks enter into this arena is such a big part of it. And the fact that you are going and playing against other people, and if you're playing a friendly evening, not necessarily a tournament, but just an evening of playing this game, you're going to see all the different possibilities, and you're thinking, wow. And it harkens back to Richard Garfield's original vision for Magic the Gathering of being bigger than the box. Because sure, you'll find some people who um, manage to work out every single possibility in a certain set, but it's a far way apart from Magic the Gathering, where now you've seen all of that. Well, the number of possibilities, you can work that out for yourself. You can work out what you would like to use. You can work out what you'd like to ignore. But in KeyForge, there is no cards that you can ignore because it might pop up in even the worst card might pop up in the best possible deck.
Yeah, I would totally. Well, in fact, it's funny you say that. There's a combination. So going back to the algorithm, one of the things the algorithm sometimes does is it says if you have this card in your deck, you must also have this card. So cards go together.
Mm-mm.
And one of them is a card called Xenos Blood Claw or something like that, or Blood Shadow, and that always comes with Toad, which is a pretty much useless card. And the idea is it balances it out by having this fantastically powerful card that always comes with this awful card. And I think that's a really clever thing with KeyForge is that they've thought about things like that, and
Mm-mm.
it's going to bug me that I can't remember the exact name of it, and I'm
It
trying to
doesn't
look over
matter.
it.
I
No,
mean,
no,
no.
no, no.
But I think that
You get the idea.
honestly, I kind of like deck building rules to be as simple as possible, just because I know you could go to the level of saying, okay, all of these cards have a points value. And I've seen cards games where they do go to that level, kind of like a miniatures game, where okay, you can have at most 100 points, but you have to have your 50 cards or whatever. And some games they say, okay, you can have one card with this symbol, three cards with this symbol, and any number of cards with this other symbol, but you can't have these. And they've tried to work out a really fair way to do deck building, but then it becomes too much for the human mind and it gets in the way of creativity. I like deck construction games. I like games where I've got to pull off things and I can ponder it myself and I can ponder, maybe I could do that. But if you're going to go that way, in my opinion, in my biased, to my personal tastes opinion, I would rather it went all the way and just gave me no restrictions, like the
Right.
bare minimum of restrictions.
Yes.
And that's kind of why I like limited, where, okay, open up a bunch of things and you can use any of these things you want. If you happen to open up five copies of a single card, you can use them all. And KeyForge says, well, we are going to make sure that you've got relatively fair decks. We're going to have an insanely complex way that these decks are built, but you don't do it. The computer does it. And we're going to focus on the playing. We're going to focus on the human connection. And I think that's a really nice thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the
As
algorithm is the balancer. So, the card was called Xenos Blood Shadow, and it's an elusive, hazardous, poison skirmish creature. So it has all these abilities, and then it comes with Toad, which can't reap, and reaping is one of the key things that practically every creature in the game can do. So it's this brilliant sort of balancing mechanism. And again, I
mm,
mentioned earlier about there are certain cards that are so
sure,
powerful. If you have more than one of them, it would be unfair. So they're restricted as well.
absolutely.
And that
I,
what I love
but
about sorry.
I think that the details might go a bit above some people's heads, but um, I totally understand the principle of matching the bad cards with the good cards and making
Yes,
sure, like, you wouldn't do that in any other situation if it wasn't AI driven. But
yes,
let's
you're right.
move on to over to you. What are you up to? You can share what's if you want to. What are you up to today? Um, I am, going to try and work towards getting up to Glasgow this year. So I guess I've got 2 days left. It'll have to be Friday or Saturday. I'll have to actually go up if I want to be there for the bells.
Oh, are you
But
going up
yeah,
for Hogmanay?
pardon?
Are you going up for Hogmanay?
That's the plan. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. Well, I hope you get up there.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I'm going to, yeah, just focus on, there's a couple of small things that I have to do for business or whatever, posting things off. But before I head up, everything else can probably be postponed, just the posting and packing. And that's what I need to do over today and tomorrow. But today, just making sure that yeah, get showered, get outside at some point, eat something, Um,
Bit of self-care.
yeah, pretty much. How about you? Is there something that you want to do? Is there something that you need to do? Please do share. I promise that I care.
That's very kind of you to ask. Thank you. I've pretty active all December, as I say. So I had this free cinema pass, and I was going to the Prince Charles Cinema a lot, and I was going to these plays. So generally, I'm going to take it easy for the next few days.
Mm-mm.
I've had I go back to work on the 3rd of January, so when I go back, I would have had 20 days off.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've had, and I've tried to avoid that whole kind of thing where you end up sort of taking a lot of time off and then just sitting around watching telly and not really doing anything.
Mm-mm.
So I've tried to make sure I've made good use of the time, but now I just sort of want to wind it down a bit and just try and be prepared for when I go back to the office.
Sometimes it's nice to have that a bit of time off just sitting back and binge watching something or playing a video game that takes a large number of hours.
Yeah, just sort of winding down and preparing
Mm-mm.
myself and trying to get my body clock back in sync because a lot of late nights have left it a little bit out of kilter, and I'm waking up at weird times and falling asleep at weird times. So I need to get back into the 9 to 5 routine.
Well, all the best with that, and I'm going to recap and wrap up before we finish up. So we talked a bit about Magic the Gathering and Mana Screw. I talked about games that I've been recently playing, Chakra, um, Cat Cafe, and Pier 18, and also, oh, I forgot the actual name of this game, Minhwatu, which is, I believe, a Korean deck for the Hanafuda card. We talked about the algorithm. We talked about all the different, um, well, the a little bit about the history of KeyForge coming from perspective of Magic, being introduced by Nick, going off and entering tournaments at D20 Cafe with Adam. We talked about even venturing into Poland, Krakow. We talked about trying to be strict with not allowing takesy backsies at a tournament, but still being a nice player and still being fair. We talked about maybe not asking for takesy backsies because it can make the other put the other person in a difficult situation. Offering but not giving like feedback. Well, not giving unless it's actually specifically requested, but offering it in the first place without just giving it without asking. Yeah, I'm struggling with words today.
Not
The
providing
nature,
unsolicited feedback.
yeah, never providing unsolicited advice, but offering the uh, asking if it
Opportunity.
would be desired,
Yeah.
and um, teaching a family who went on to be one of the better players. And obviously, anything that you do yourself a lot, you're going to get pretty good at it. And it forces you to adapt, but it also forces you to remember things. And Stuart's having a good memory to remember stuff. We talked about my personal, whether I would get into the game and whether anyone else would get into the game. And I'm curious to all those who are lurking and just watching, would he get into Keyforge? Do you think he will get into Keyforge? Has this been um yeah, has have you heard
Inspiring.
about Keyforge before? Has it inspired you to do anything? I mean, Panic said they were already curious about it, presumably haven't played it yet, would check it out if offered. But I think that's a very common thread where it's about being near the places and you are able to set up a community for people within maybe 5 miles of yourself.
Well, also I can play online, as I mentioned earlier,
Mm-mm.
TCO. If
That's a
people
fair
want
point.
me to teach them, just get in touch via Facebook, as I say, and I'm happy to sort of go through when we've got a mutually convenient time to sort of explain the game.
Okay, and if you want to check me out, I am Stuff by Bez in all of the places. Tomorrow, I don't have any particular topic, Friday. Yes, I don't have anything scheduled until the 3rd, but I'm going to be talking about other stuff, I'm sure. And the 1st and 2nd, I'll probably be doing a bit of a recap of 2022 and maybe some predictions or hopes for 2023. Because I like to have my recap of 2022 come after the year that I'm talking about. I know that might seem a bit pedantic, but it really does bug me that when I'm being told who I've listened to the most or what I've played the most, and they're missing, half a month,
That's a
or
fair
even
point.
in some
I agree with
cases.
you. Yeah, you shouldn't make a top 10 list until the year's over, should you?
Yeah, and I do like the way that Paul Grogan does it, which is Paul Grogan's coming up with their top games of 2021 list around now, which I think is reasonable timing.
Yeah,
So Paul's got a bit of time to appreciate these games and learn how good they actually are.
yeah. Make an educated assessment.
Yes. And Hello it says I'm totally on time, right? Um, yeah, you just missed the recap. Um, So share, spread the word. Thank you everyone for being here, no matter when you turned up, and lots of love to Stuart. Thank you for the lovely chat. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, just thank you for having me on. Thank you for a lovely chat. Thank you for your kind words. I wish you and all your listeners or viewers, sorry, listeners, viewers, whichever way they're doing it, a happy new year. I hope it's prosperous for us all. And I wish you good luck with your immigration plans. And I hope to see you before you go.
I will be very disappointed if you're not at my leaving party.
I plan to be there. I would do absolutely my best to be there. And
Awesome.
yeah,
And I'm still sorting out the contract, but yeah, it's going to be in a hotel in Milton Keynes,
right.
11th, 12th, 13th, and of August. So that's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'll probably personally be there Thursday to Monday, but yeah, it's officially a Friday to Sunday event, and hopefully it will be a celebration of me, my games, and also some designers that I know and I'm particularly fond of will be invited to share their own stuff. Like Alan Paul and Charlie Paul will be doing some LARPs. I'm excited to have other people running LARPs and Dave
I
Wedrock.
I imagine it to be an epic event. I think anybody who's not there that could have been there will deeply regret not making it. So I will be there unless some unfathomable thing stops me. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
Awesome. And for now, lots of love to everyone. And bye, bye, bye,
Bye.
bye.
Thank
This
you.
is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, bye, everyone. Bye, bye, Stuart.
Bye, Bez. Thank you very much.